get started. A couple announcements, sort of business things. So, course materials downloaded here. Course materials downloaded here. But the podcasts of this lecture are not available here. They're available at the website of the Office of Instructional Resources, or Office of Instructional Development, OID. And they're posted. The podcasting part of this is a courtesy. It's sort of offered by the university, but they're not required to do it at all. They're doing it because they're nice. And it takes them sometimes a day or two to post the lecture. So if the lecture isn't posted immediately afterwards, well, give it time. But they are promising that they will post eventually, all of the lectures. And apparently there's also a UCLA channel at YouTube where they'll be posting the exact same videos. So they'll be both posted at the Office of Instructional Development and on YouTube, one or the other. So that's this part. Course reader, I see people who are getting those. Please read the syllabus. We went over it last time, but there's all sorts of questions in there that can be answered in the syllabus. And the syllabus is kind of like a contract. It's kind of what our agreement is. I wrote it, you read it, and that's the agreement. So if you want to know about anything for the course, do that. The other thing is this. I didn't get a chance to say this last time. The text in the reader, I wrote half of it. So I like it. You'll be tested on everything in the reader and everything in the lecture. The lecture will cover a lot of the reader, but not everything. If there's something in the reader that I never talk about in class or even allude to or refer to in any way, you're still totally, completely responsible for it, because I haven't forgotten that I wrote it. Get it? Got it. All right, then. Now let's talk about something of substance. So, you know what never happened to Albert Einstein? No one ever went up to Albert Einstein at a party and said, I've got a theory about quantum physics. No one ever went up to him and said, Albert, you study the space-time continuum. Well, I'll tell you a thing or two about the space-time continuum. No one ever said that to Albert Einstein. But if you study relationships, everyone has a theory about relationships. Everybody comes up to me and says, I'll tell you a thing or two about relationships. You've been studying for 20 years. Well, I'm a butcher, and I'll tell you something about relationships. But the fact is that everybody does have something to say about relationships, because everybody has them. I mean, people really have direct experience with intimate relationships in their lives. Even if you've never been in one, you still know people who've been in one. You still were raised by people who were in one. So everyone has something to say about relationships. And if you go to, let's say, the self-help section of your bookstore, you'll see that almost all those people have written a book about relationships. There's tons of books about relationships, and they all offer different advice. And there's tons of people who haven't written books who'll give you advice about relationships, what you should do. There's advice columnists, there's your friends, there's your family, and they'll tell you things. The problem is that what people have to say about relationships often disagrees with each other. People disagree. And they disagree about kind of important questions. So let's say you currently do not have a romantic partner and you want one. What should you do? Well, people will tell you what you should do, but they'll tell you different things. Should you tell someone you're interested in them? Let them know that you're interested. Or should you play hard to get? Say, hey, I'm too good for you. What's the best strategy? There are people who've written entire books on both sides of this question. Well, which is right? What do people find? What's more attractive if what you're trying to do is find a mate? What about, okay, now you've found a mate. Now you're in this relationship, and there's areas of conflict. There's things you disagree about with your partner. What should you do about those disagreements? Should you avoid them? Sort of let them lie? We don't have to we don't have to argue through every single thing we disagree about. Or is that a bad strategy? Should you dive into the things you disagree about? Well, it kind of matters. I mean, if there's an answer, you'd want to know what the answer is. How about divorce? Okay, so now your relationship, you got married, congratulations, but then it went badly. And now you have kids, and your marriage is on the rocks. What do you think you should do? What you should do about it if you care about those kids? Should you break up? Should you divorce so that your kids aren't exposed to this bad marriage? Or should you stay together so your kids aren't exposed to the problems associated with divorce? Well, if you are married and you have kids and you are contemplating divorce, you want to know the answer to this question. But here's the problem. People have written books with different answers. You can buy books that say, don't get divorced ever because it destroys your kids. And there's some books that'll say, if you're unhappy, don't stay together for your kids because being exposed to your unhappiness will destroy your kids. Well, these are just pulled out of a hat. These are just a handful of issues where those are kind of important questions. I mean, those are really serious questions. And the answers that people decide are true will affect people's lives. Some people will behave differently towards someone who's a potential mate. Some people will behave differently towards their partners. Some people will behave differently towards divorce, depending on what they think is true. But how do we know what's true? How will we figure out what's true about intimate relationships? And since this course is all about talking about what's true, what do we really know about intimate relationships? Well, how will we ever decide what's true? Especially when everyone thinks they know what's true and everyone has real legitimate experiences. How are we going to figure it out? Well, first of all, experience matters. I would be the last person, and I'm not trying to say that someone's real experience is invalid. No, I'm not at all. People's real experiences with their relationships matter. The problem is that everybody has different experiences. And there's many, many different people with different experiences. So we've got people who, the world is so complicated that there's people who played hard to get and found a mate. There's people who expressed interest and found a mate. There's people who divorced and their kids were okay. There's people who divorced and their kids were not okay. So there's a wide range of experiences. But what if we want to give advice? Well, is it enough to say, well, you know, a friend of mine had this experience, or I had this experience, and you should do what I did? If we're going to give advice to large groups of people, that's probably not sufficient. If we're going to set social policy, it's probably not sufficient to say, you know, this is what I experienced growing up. It's not to say that your experience is invalid, but it may not be sufficient as a basis for policy or a basis for giving advice to others, because people are different. What we really want is some way, some means of studying these issues systematically, of figuring out what's true, what are the answers to some of these questions. We may not be able to answer them all, but let's get as close as we can, and let's try to get answers that might transcend individual experience, that might apply to lots of people. Maybe not everybody, but lots of people. Well, what are the tools? How can we do that? What tools have we got for sorting out the truth, for answering questions? If you've got two people who disagree about how relationships work, how can we be the scientists that come in and say, well, the truth is there is an answer. There are answers. It's possible to answer these questions. And here's how we did it. And that's what this lecture is about. What are our tools for answering questions about intimate relationships? And I put this lecture at the beginning of the course because we're going to be using these tools for the rest of the course. For the rest of the course, we're going to be trying to answer these questions that I brought up and many others. I want to start out by saying, how do we do this thing called scientific research on relationships? That's what today is about. So let's start. Oops. Well, if we're going to study something, it sort of implies that we're going to measure something. And relationship science has a difficult task. We don't have an easy task like Einstein. You're a physicist. What do you want to measure? Distance? You can measure distance. We can measure distance with a ruler, and you can get a very precise reading, and everyone knows what a foot is. What are you going to measure? Temperature? Temperature is easy. You get a thermometer, you can measure temperature, and two people with two thermometers will agree down to many significant differences about temperature. What are you going to measure? Force? You're going to measure weight? It's easy to measure those things. Physicist, you are a wimp if you're a physicist. You want something hard, measure what we measure. Because if you're studying relationships, what do you want to measure? I want to measure love. I want to measure commitment. I want to measure satisfaction with my relationship. I want to measure conflict, disagreement, closeness, intimacy. Where's that thermometer? Where's the intimacy-mometer? Well, there is no intimacy-mometer because what we want to measure in relationship science is something that we call a construct. And a construct is an abstract idea. Now, some people say, oh, construct, that means you study imaginary stuff. No, that's not what it means. Love isn't imaginary. Commitment isn't imaginary. Conflict isn't imaginary. These are real things with real consequences. People die for love. Wars are fought over conflict. The fact that an idea is abstract does not make it imaginary. It just makes it hard to measure. So how do you measure or do science about constructs? Let me just say one more thing about construct. A construct is something that humans have constructed. It's an abstract idea that was constructed by the human capacity to think abstractly. We didn't create temperature. If there were no humans, the sun would still be really hot and Pluto would still be really cold. But if there are no humans, there wouldn't be an idea of commitment. There wouldn't be an idea of love. So that's why it's called a construct. Now the question is, okay, how do we measure it? Well, the short answer is you cannot measure a construct, at least not directly. We can't stick a fork into love. We can't put a bunch of love on a scale and see how much we've got. So, we have to transform our constructs. We have to somehow find something about the construct that we can measure. And the process of doing so is called operationalization. At least that's the fancy language that scientists use. Operationalization is a process of translating an abstract idea into concrete terms so it can be studied. So, I've got all sorts of ideas, abstract ideas: commitment, love, satisfaction, conflict, closeness. When I decide I want to operationalize these ideas, what I'm saying is I want to find a way of transforming the idea, or I want a manifestation of the idea that I can measure, given that I can't measure an abstract idea directly. So this is a pretty important process. This is the process that lets science happen, that lets almost all social science happen. Poverty is an idea. Income is an operationalization. Health is a construct. The number of times you went to the doctor last year is an operationalization. Does that make sense? So people who care about health, you can't measure health. There's no healthometer. But I can say, well, for my research, I'm operationalizing health as the number of times you went to the doctor. And I'm assuming that the fewer times you went to the doctor, the healthier you are. There's an implication of this. Maybe it's already occurred to you. For any construct, there's an infinite number of possible operationalizations. If I want to study love, I can operationalize it a bunch of ways. Well, how have relationship scientists done it? And let's use love as our example today. Because love is something that you'll hear smart people, or people who claim to be smart, saying, oh, come now. Who can measure love? You know, why try to measure love? And people have said that to me. Oh, you study marriage? How can you really measure something like marriage? Well, I'll tell you. There's lots of ways, is the short answer to that question. Lots of ways to operationalize the construct of love. Let's talk about some of them. Here's one. How can we measure love? One strategy would be the strategy of self-reports. A self-report is simply the report that someone gives you when you ask them a question. How tall are you? If you tell me how tall you are, that's a self-report. If I measure how tall you are, that's something else. But if I ask you a question, you answer it, your answer is your self-report. Well, there's a lot of things in life that I'm almost never going to find out unless I just ask you and believe your answer. For example, now, let's say I had a camera, I could follow you throughout your life like Jim Carrey in The Truman Show. I might be able to observe how many relationships you have. I might be able to observe a lot about your life. But if I want to know, how much do you like that person? It's very hard for me to find out unless I just ask you. If I want to know, how do you feel right now? How do you feel? Are you happy or sad right this minute? I can't tell by looking at you. I basically have no choice. I got to ask you. So a lot of times, self-reports get us exactly what we want. A sense of what you're feeling, what's inside your head. I can't open you up, at least not easily. So, how can we measure love? One way is you ask people, hey, how much do you love that person? Now that's the simplest way. Just, how much do you love that person? A lot. Thank you. Here's another way. On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the absolute best love ever, 1 being hate, how much do you love that person? Oh, a 9. Now that's something. Because that person gave me an 8 over there. Oh, I guess you love this person more than that person does. So now I'm getting close. These are all different operationalizations. But you can imagine these are valid ways of operationalizing this feeling of love. Now, people have been interested in this question for quite a while, many decades. And one popular measure of love, one popular question, presuming to measure love, is something called, originally, the love scale. It looks like this. There's a lot to read. You don't have to read it all. But here's what, this was developed by a guy named Zick Rubin, who was at Harvard at the time. And this is published in 1970. So imagine a couple years after 1968, the Summer of Love, that probably inspired him to measure it. And he said, okay, I want to know something. He said, what questions could I ask that would really measure love? So before you ask a question, you have to have an idea of what you're asking about. So Zick Rubin asked these 13 questions and said these 13 questions are the love scale. I think that people's answers to these questions are a good operationalization of love. What do you think? Let's take a look at some of them. Rate how much you agree or disagree with these statements, where a 9 is I totally agree and a 1 is I don't agree at all. How about this one? One of my primary concerns is my partner's welfare. Zick Rubin said if you agree with that statement, that's love. The more you agree, the higher your score. How about this one? I would do almost anything for my partner. How about this one? When I'm with my partner, I spend a good deal of time just looking at him or her. Oh. So, the other two items were about sacrifice. But this is about reward, isn't it? So some of these items are about love. So what is Zick saying? He's saying something about love by the selection of the items. He's operationalizing love. He's saying, I think I understand what love is. He's saying love is, well, it's these 13 ideas, but they have groupings. One is love is a willingness to sacrifice, a feeling that makes you willing to sacrifice for somebody. And love is, according to Zick Rubin, a feeling of being rewarded by somebody. feel maybe possessive. We talked about that last time. If my partner were feeling badly, my duty would be to cheer him or her up. Where's another reward one? Where's all the reward? I feel responsible for my well-being. Zick is clearly making a point here. He's operationalizing love as a willingness to sacrifice for somebody else. There's a lot more items about that than about reward. Here's one. If I could never be with my partner, I'd feel miserable. So it's the opposite. It's saying, not just that I find this person rewarding, but that if the lack of this person would be misery-making to me. My point is that you may quibble. No, you may more than quibble. You may vehemently argue with this operationalization. You may say, no, that's not the way to operationalize love. There's a better way. There's different questions you could ask. And let me tell you, people have asked them. You think this is the last love scale? No, it's just the first love scale. There are books just with love scales in them. Tons of different ones. There's so many ways to measure love. But I'll tell you another thing. They tend to go together. Somebody who gets a high score on this scale tends to get a high score on all the other scales. Because they're all kind of tapping this underlying and unmeasurable abstract idea. These are just different operationalizations. But sometimes they do the job. So, I mean, what are you trying to predict? Whether people stay together? Whether relationships stay together? Well, guess what? People who score high on this are more likely to stay with their partner over time. People who score high on this are more likely to do nice things for their partner. And those are the ways that we might evaluate whether the operationalization is a good operationalization. And some are better than others. So this is just a love scale. You can imagine developing scales for almost anything you want. How about an intimacy scale? How about a closeness scale? How about a willingness to consider divorce scale? All of these scales exist. How about a commitment scale? All of these scales exist. And there are ways to develop them that make them better or worse for different purposes. My point is just, this is one of the tools we have to develop good questions for simply asking people about what we want to know about. And when we're talking about feelings and intentions, asking people is one of the best tools that we have. And these kind of scales are one of the tools that are used constantly in research on close relationships and intimate relationships. Why are they used so constantly? Well, here's why. One is they're easy. Raise your hand if you've ever filled out one of these scales. Yeah. I mean, they're so easy that you can publish them in Cosmopolitan magazine. Like popular magazines will say, hey, on page 43, take your own love test. And you could score it yourself at the bottom. And if I want to know what all of you felt, I could pass out a form. You could all fill it out. I could score it, and I could say, okay, now I know the average score in the class. I mean, the course evaluations that you'll fill out at the end are just another example of self-reports. So, it's cheap. It doesn't cost much. Just give people a piece of paper. It's quick. And as we've said, sometimes it gets at exactly what we want to know. So there's a lot of self-report data in this field, which is fine. But the problem is there are disadvantages to self-report data. There are disadvantages. One of the disadvantages is people don't always tell the truth. So if you ask people a question, they don't always tell you the true answer. So for example, in research on domestic violence, intimate partner violence, think about that's a pretty serious topic. Now you're asking somebody a very sensitive question. You're asking somebody, do you hit the person that you claim to love? That's a pretty serious question. And they've asked that question in couples. So you ask the male partner and you ask the female partner the same question about themselves. And then you ask them the same question about each other. So you ask them, how much has your partner hit you? Well, in study after study, men underreport. It's not a shock. But men are less likely to say, yeah, I hit my spouse, where their spouses are more likely to say, yeah, he hits me. You can understand people not wanting to tell the truth there. There's a concept in this field called the social desirability bias. The social desirability bias is our desire to look good to the person asking the questions. Well, if that bias makes us less likely to answer sensitive questions in a way that will make us look bad, even if that is the true answer. You get this all the time in other fields. Hey, how racist are you? People are very reluctant. Raise your hand if you're a racist. Oh, people don't want to admit it, even though there's a lot of racism in the world. It's the same in relationships. Hey, here's a question. When's the last time you cheated on your partner? No, go ahead, I won't tell anybody. So these are questions where if you ask people, if you rely entirely on self-reports, you're going to get underestimates because people don't always tell you the truth. But there's another problem with self-reports. It's not, again, it doesn't mean that all self-reports are bad. It just means you have to be cautious. The second problem with self-reports is people don't always know the truth. People don't always know what's true. Let me give you an example. One of my favorite studies ever. Jacobson and Moore, the late Neil Jacobson and his student. Old study, but a classic, an oldie but a goodie. Here's what they did. And they thought they were being very clever. They wanted to know, how do married couples spend their time? So they asked, they got husbands and wives, two members of the same partnership, to answer questions about the specific behaviors that they'd engaged in together over the previous 24 hours. So the question is, hi, think back over the last 24 hours. It's 3:30. Think back since yesterday at 3:30. Now, in those 24 hours, just put a check mark next to every behavior that happened in your marriage from this list of 200 or 400 behaviors, like a long list. And then they asked the other partner to do the same thing over the same period of time with the same list. And then they compared the two lists to see if partners agreed about what happened in the last 24 hours. And what they found was that a husband and wife in the same marriage agreed about what happened in the last 24 hours less than 50% of the time. They disagreed about whether they had had sex at 50%. Now, what's going on? Now, you might imagine, hey, I would have known about something like that, or I knew what happened. I mean, I was there. There's a couple of reasons why people may not know what's going on. One thing is, people don't have perfect memories. Did that happen yesterday or the day before? Did it happen at 3:30 or was it really at 1:45? So a lot of times people just don't remember exactly what happened, particularly with something frequent. You know, imagine someone that you talk to a lot. How many times did you talk to that person last week? You know, so imagine someone you talk to frequently. How many times did you talk to that person? How many separate conversations did you have last week? Well, it's hard to know. I mean, I wasn't counting. You ask me, oh, I saw my wife. How many times did we hug in the last 24 hours? Honestly, I'm a married guy. I don't know. 5? The truth is that although I was there, I was the recipient of the hugs, I wasn't counting. And so it's tough. I can't answer the question truthfully because I just don't know the answer. People have memory problems. Memory is a problem. So when you're asking about those kind of things, self-reports aren't so great. So self-reports are sometimes when self-reports are the only thing you have, but there are other times when they don't get you where you want to be. So, well, what else is there then? Let's say we want another strategy. I said there's many ways of operationalizing the same stuff. What if I don't want to self-report? What else have I got? Another thing I can do is systematic observation, totally separate strategy. So I want to measure love, right? And Zick Rubin asked people. He said, hey, Do you spend a lot of time just staring at the person that you love? That's not a bad question. If the answer is yes, then, oh, you must really love that person if you say that you spend a lot of time staring at that person. But if that's what I think love is all about, gazing at someone in the eye, what else could I do? I can watch two people. And I could actually measure with a stopwatch the amount of time that they spend gazing at each other in the eye. And people have done this, by the way. You bring couples into the lab, and you have, they have these eye tracker stuff where you can actually see what people look at. And you can actually stopwatch, measure, for this couple, how much time do they spend looking at each other right in the eye. And guess what? Here's something interesting. People who say that they love each other more actually do spend more time staring at each other, moony-eyed, right into each other's eyes. Isn't that nice? So you might imagine, hey, that's another way of operationalizing love. Actually pick a behavior that I think is associated with love or is part of love and just observe it. Just watch it. And that's what people do. And people in relationship science, there's a lot of very interesting observational research. And one of the questions that people have to ask first is, well, what do we observe? Is eye gaze what it's all about? Well, there's lots of things people observe in research on relationships. One of the things people observe a lot is verbal communication. We'll be talking a lot about that in this course, obviously, since this is a course about human communication, ostensibly. And one of the things we do in our labs is we bring people into the labs. I'll be talking about this a lot later on. Put them in two chairs. This is how we do it. We put them in chairs facing each other. So here's one partner and there's the other partner. And we set up cameras behind them. So this person has a camera right here, and we don't try to hide it. The camera's right here, pointing at that person's face. And this person has a camera behind that person's head, pointing at that person's face. And they both have cables that connect to the other room, and we can see them on a screen. I'll show you a little video about it later in the course. Well, we can record what people say, and we can do all sorts of things with those recordings. So here's what I want to do to operationalize love. I can count how many times do people say I love you. I can just count it. I can say, if two people spend 10 minutes together, how many times do they say sweet things to each other? And I decide that's challenging, because I have to now decide, well, what is a sweet thing? What's the difference between something nice and something mean? But once I've decided on my definitions, I can have any of you come in and say, okay, I want to show you the videotape, and I'm going to ask you to count how many times they do something nice, or they say something nice. And the people who say more nice things, I'm going to say they're more in love than the people who are less nice to each other. I can systematically observe verbal communication. Or I can systematically observe nonverbal communication. In research on marriage, one of the pioneers of research on nonverbal communication is a professor named John Gottman, formerly at the University of Washington. And John Gottman is one of the world's pioneers who said, it's not enough to see what people tell us. We have to watch what they do. And he did. And he said, even the verbal content isn't enough. We want to see, how do people express themselves non-verbally? So, for example, in his lab, he has the same chairs set up, but he connects people to a variety of different implements. For example, he has a motion detector under the chair, so you can see how much people fidget. With the idea being that people who are happier don't fidget as much. They're just more relaxed when they're talking to their partner. If you're talking to their partner, it's soothing. Another thing that John Gottman is famous for is saying there's some nonverbal indicators of feeling badly towards someone. So he's operationalizing contempt. Contempt is a construct. His operationalization of contempt, one of them, is if you, in response to what someone says, roll your eyes. So imagine this. Is there any loving way to do this? Tell me something. Oh, really? In my lab and in my house, we call that the Gottman eye roll. Honey, was that a Gottman eye roll? Don't give me the Gottman eye roll. Yeah. Because what does that eye roll say? That eye roll is me saying, whatever. It's saying, what you have to say is useless to me, is of no value at all. And that, my friends, is contempt. And Gottman says, and has shown, that if you look at two people, and they're talking to each other, and one of them does a Gottman eye roll, those people are less likely to be in love with each other. His operationalization of love is different. It's when someone says something, reveals something to themselves, instead a tendency to respond with engagement. To say, tell me more, I care. Or to lean forward in your chair if you're looking at nonverbal communication. Another thing that Gottman looks at, that he codes, that he systematically observes, is expressions of emotion. Just a look on your face. When someone walks in the room, do your eyebrows go up? There's a system, there's actually a very complicated system which I forgot what it's called. It's a system, though, that codes the movement of facial muscles in your face. So this is nonverbal. It's not about the words you're saying. It's about how your eyebrows are moving. People who are in love, when they see each other, their eyebrows go up. And their cheeks lift. Like, oh, there you are. Hey. People who are not, so look at how wide open my face is. Hey, that's awesome. People who are not in love or are mad at each other, there's like a muscle. I don't remember the name of it, but there's a muscle that means, hey, I'm mad at you. It's a muscle that contracts right here. It pulls your eyebrows together. It lowers them. Your cheeks go down. Your lips go down. They can code that. That's an operationalization of irritation. I don't like that. You don't want to see that. You want to see this. But that's not the only thing we could code. We can look at other things. We can look at written communication. So that's an observation. I can observe what you write to each other. So there's colleagues of mine, even in this building, who are looking at text messages that couples send to each other. So couples have agreed to submit all the text messages that they've exchanged in the last week. Now that's systematic observation. Okay? So now I'm observing. So now I've got all this stuff. What do? What would be an observationalization of love? How can I pull some love juice out of this stuff? What would be, let's say I gave it to you. What might you look at in these text messages to try to figure out which of these couples love each other more, which of these couples love each other less? Jessica. The other person saying thanks. Very interesting idea. So Jessica would look at this, and she would count up the amount of times that an I love you was not reciprocated. She would count them. Just say, how many times does the person say I love you? How many times was the next text message, did it not feature an I love you back, or something comparable? And I'm going to count that, and people who score high, I'm going to say they're not doing so well. People who score low on the unreciprocated I love yous, they're going to be higher, and that's going to be a better relationship. Nice. That's a great operationalization. What you got? What's your name? Donna.
Possibly the way that they spell I love you with shortcuts.
Okay, Donna, let's pursue this. So Donna says, for those of you watching at home, maybe people who spell with shortcuts are different than people not. What's your hypothesis, Donna? Do I want my partner to say L-U-V, or do I want my partner to spell it out? If they really love me, you'd spell it correctly. Okay, so Donna is a stickler for grammar, and she would like to spell her out. Okay, that's not bad. What else you got? Oh, what's your name in the green? Go, Cassie. Can you do that in a text message? Okay, well then. Just count the number of hearts. David. Latency. Ooh, now that's good. I mean, they're all good, but that's interesting. So what David said was, what about latency of the responses? And to translate that into regular English, what he means is, how much time does it take between receipt of the text message and your response? And the hypothesis, David, what would be the hypothesis? Nice. That's subtle. That's very subtle. Oh, that's great. What's your name? Luke.
Maybe like the amount of inside talk, like that you don't really understand it, like lovey-dovey stuff, that's kind of
Interesting. Luke, it's an interesting idea. So Luke says maybe the amount of like inside, personal, uninterpretable information to an outsider. The problem is that as outsiders, that'd be hard to code. It's an interesting idea, Luke. But it would be hard for us to define so that we could all agree on it what kind of communication was that kind of lovey-dovey insider stuff. Do you remember that time that you did that thing that I found very rewarding? Tough one. So wait, let me just tell you, let me move on. Let me tell you the people, okay, first of all, it's all super great ideas. My colleagues are doing none of those things. What they're doing instead is also interesting. They take all of the text messages and feed them into a computer program that counts the number of words and how many times they each appear. And what they're finding is the couples that are more in love use the word we and us more. What? You have a problem with that? It's very simple. The people who are more in love, by the way, that doesn't say that any of your ideas are fantastic ideas, and they may also be great operationalizations of love, but they're just doing something different. What they're doing is counting the number of times people say we or us. The more that people in their language talk about themselves as a couple, the more they seem to love each other. Just different ways of operationalizing the concept. I'm just saying there's many different ways of operationalizing any constant. But in this case, that's what they're observing, and they're observing it systematically. Now, how about biological responses? Now, nowadays, relationship researchers, as Heidi was pointing out last time, are getting further into looking at biological reactions to people, like brain activation. So my colleague Art Aaron at SUNY Stony Brook is taking people who claim to be in love, people who score high on Zick-Rubin's love scale, in fact, and putting them in a functional magnetic resonance imaging scanner to see what kind of parts of their brain are lighting up. And what he'd like to say, what he's trying to do is develop an observational operationalization of love that is about brain activation. He'd like to say that love is when this part of your brain lights up. That's interesting, and it's observational. Because you're not asking people what part of your brain lights up. You're actually going in with an fMRI machine and observing it. There are other things you can observe. My colleague Janice Keycold-Glaser, who's a professor at someplace, I forget. But the point is that anyone remember? Anyone? No? Okay, so the point is that Keycold-Glaser, what she's interested in is how stressed do people get when they're talking about problems with their partner? Because this idea is that if you get really stressed, that's bad. Now, how can I study this? How can I study how stressed I get? Well, I can ask you, on a scale of 1 to 7, how stressed are you when you talk to your partner? That's a possibility. That's not a terrible idea, but she's got a better way. What she does is she actually gets blood samples from people who are about to talk to their partner. So she gets couples, she brings them in the lab, she says, hi, we are going to have you guys talk to each other about a problem in your relationship in about 2 minutes. So you know what you're going to do in 2 minutes? Talk to your partner. Oh, and by the way, let's take a little blood sample from you. And she can actually measure what are the levels of stress hormone floating around these people's bodies before the interaction and after the interaction. She gets another blood sample. For her, the level of stress hormone in your body, the level of cortisol, is an operationalization of how stressed you are. Well, she didn't ask them. She could have asked them, but she didn't ask them. She's observing instead a biological response. Well, that's cool. Yes, Jessica.
So what's her hypothesis? People who love each other more are less stressed?
We'll talk about this more later, but Keycold-Glaser's study, since you asked, is she thinks that being in a bad relationship is bad for your health, and we talked about that last time. But she wants to know, and there's lots of evidence that that's true. She wants to know, why is it true? She says, why is it that just because I'm in a bad relationship, I'm actually physically sicker? And what she's finding, fascinating, is that people who are in a bad relationship have higher levels of cortisol, especially when they talk to their partners. Well, that higher levels of cortisol, as a general rule, are bad for your body, I believe. Tell me, what's your name in the back? Jessica also? Okay. Yes. Interesting hypothesis. So Jessica says, well, maybe problems are more threatening for people who are more in love. That's an empirical question. So we can talk about that. The fact is, I mean, between you and me, there's nothing inherent at all about being, even if you're in love, about being threatened by a problem. You can certainly imagine this. I'm so in love, we can talk about our problems. It's not threatening at all because I know that nothing could possibly threaten the deep, fundamental bond that we two share. That's also a legitimate position. So then we would ask, hey, you might be able to distinguish between people who are threatened by problems and say they're in love, or people who are not threatened by problems and say they're in love. What's the difference? I just wrote a paper on that just last week, but we'll talk about it another day. What's your name? Deja. Yes. It's a great point, Deja. So Deja says, I mean, we're getting off on a tangent a little bit, which I'm going to tie off as soon as I comment on Deja's point. So Deja says, wouldn't a couple's response to dealing with problems be different depending on whether they had already successfully dealt with problems in the past? That's an outstanding insight, and I think quite true. It would also depend on the nature of the problem. It would depend on a lot of things, that it does. My point for today is not to settle that issue, which we'll address later, but to say that we have a lot of tools. If we want to operationalize love and we want to try to observe something that we think is part of love, there's lots of things we can observe. There's lots of directions we can go. And observation also has pros and cons, advantages and disadvantages. The advantages are, sometimes if you choose the right thing, it's very relevant. A lot of times, observational research is studying exactly what we really want to know about. If you want to know about what couples do together, you can ask them, or you can watch them. Well, if you watch them, then you're actually seeing exactly what it is you want to know. That's awesome. A lot of this data gives us incredible detail. So in my lab, we videotape couples talking for 10-minute conversations, then another 10-minute conversation. We have 40 minutes from each couple, and then we get them again next year. These are rich. Think about even the text messages that you were just imagining what you would do with. There's so much that you were thinking of doing with. There's so many details. You could look at response latency. You can look at the word count. You can look at the spelling and the use of hearts and cartoons. Well, observational data gives us a lot of details, and that's awesome. Observational data also forces us to rise to a very interesting challenge. It requires us to define things. Now, self-report does too. So whereas Zick Rubin, to develop his scale, had to think, well, I'm going to ask questions about love. I have to know what love is to ask the right questions. It's the same with observation. If you want to observe something and sort of count something, you have to know what to count, which means you have to define things well. You have to know what you're looking for. But if you do define things well, it makes for better science, because you have a more concrete, defined operationalization. The problem with observational data, well, there are a couple. One is, it's very expensive. It's so much easier. Just ask people, do you love somebody on a scale of 1 to 10? Yes or no? It's much harder to bring people into the lab, record them together, then bring other people to watch the tapes, train those people to notice when they're gazing in each other's eyes, count how long they're doing it, enter all the data into a computer. That is a pain. So it takes a lot of effort to do observational research. But it's a nice payoff. The other problem is the problem of reactivity. Unfortunately, most of the time, you're not allowed to study people without them knowing it. There was a famous case. People were trying to do research on same-sex sexual encounters in bathrooms. This was back in the I guess, late 60s, early 70s. I mean, it was a long time ago. And the researchers basically went into a bathroom and just sort of waited around and sort of tried to observe what was going on in there. And observed a lot of stuff, which at the time was illegal, and that was considered unethical research because the people being observed had not given their consent to being observed. So nowadays, you have to tell people that you're observing them. Well, let me ask you. Imagine that you are with your romantic partner, and you've got an issue and you want to deal with it. And then I come and say, hi, I'm a scientist. No, 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 go ahead. You have that talk. I'll just watch. Will the talk be any different by the fact that you know I'm watching? Well, the answer is it's a lot different, although in somewhat surprising ways. Here's something interesting. Gottman, I think it was Gottman, did this study, very interesting. He brought people into the lab, couples. He said, here's a problem. You've got a problem in your relationship. I want you to talk about it right here in our research room. So he has a research room on campus, just like I do, with two chairs facing each other, and they're talking. But then he said, now go home with this tape recorder. And next time you have a fight at home, put on the tape recorder. Where were they more negative? In the lab or at home? At home. At home, they were much more negative than in the lab. So at home, in the lab, they were quieter. So which means in the lab, we're getting that people react to the situation. If you want to know how much people fight, how emotional they get, in the lab, you're not always going to see it. Here's another thing about reactivity. If you bring people in and you say, hi, it's now time to have a discussion about a problem, that might be different than the kind of natural problems that people have. So you don't always know if what you're measuring is exactly what you would see if you weren't measuring it. That's the reactivity problem. People change in ways you can't always anticipate. Luke?
Would this still fall under the social desirability file?
Could be. Could be. I think you get reactivity whether or not you have social desirability, but it's part of it. So as Luke was saying, sometimes couples don't want to look bad, so they're nicer to each other when they know you're watching. Yeah, that makes sense. The other problem is the meaning problem. The fact of the matter is that we don't always know what a behavior means to the people who are engaging in the behavior. So if I videotape a couple and they say, oh, you are full of crap, is that a nice thing to say or a mean thing to say? It seems kind of mean. But you could almost imagine a couple saying it like that's just the way they talk to each other. You know, they're like, oh, you are so full of crap. Oh, oh, we are so close that we can tease each other in that way, but it's part of our fun. It's part of the way we interact with each other. We sort of rib each other a little bit. We're so close to each other that we can afford a little good-natured ribbing, maybe. You can imagine that there are couples that way. The problem with observational data is that we're imposing meaning on the behavior. And it may not have the same meaning to the people. Jessica in the back was saying, well, you know, a problem might be threatening to the couple. And then Daisha was saying, yeah, but it might not be threatening to other couples. Well, how do we know? Sometimes observing gets us far, but only not far enough. Sometimes we want to combine observational data with self-report data to get back in the head. Possible. My point is, no single operationalization is perfect. Observational data has its pros and cons. Self-report data have its pros and cons. As consumers of research, what we're going to do is be sensitive to the advantages and limitations of every method, every tool that we pull off our tool belt and use to answer these questions. But eventually we've made a decision. We've decided how we're going to measure love or whatever it is that we're studying. Now we have to design the research. What I mean by design the research is to say, how will the study be structured? Under what conditions and circumstances will we gather this data? Will we do our measuring? Most of the research that we'll see is cross-sectional research. And what cross-sectional research means is all the data was collected at a single moment in time. So for example, if I give you a scale, a piece of paper, and I say, rate how much you love your partner. And I give you another piece of paper and I say, rate how often you see movies with your partner. I might then say, oh, it looks like the people who see movies more often are also more in love. That's cross-sectional research. I said, well, at one moment, these two things go together, and sometimes that's what I want to do. Sometimes all I want to do is describe a single moment in time, and cross-sectional research is not bad for that. I just want to describe how things are at a single moment in time. But in this course, as I was saying on Wednesday, we want to do more than that. The fundamental mystery of relationships is how they change over time. I tried to convey that on Wednesday, that the puzzle of relationships is not that some people are happy and some people are unhappy, but that the same people can be happy at one time and then later be unhappy with the same partners. That's not a question of how things are. That's a question of how things change. And if we want to know how things change, we need to do longitudinal research. Longitudinal research is research that gathers data from the same individuals across multiple points in time. If you want to predict something, you need longitudinal research. Makes sense, not rocket science. People can get confused, though. And it can get confusing because sometimes cross-sectional research gives you different information and different answers than longitudinal research. And to make this point, I will tell you the story of the disappearing curve. Love this story. There was research to answer a question. The question was this: over the course of married people's lives, how does their satisfaction with the relationship, on average, change? The question is, on average, how does satisfaction with the marriage change? The first research that answered this question was cross-sectional research, and here's how they did it. They got a bunch of people, some of whom had been married just a few years, some of whom had been married a few more years, some of whom had been married a long, long time. And they asked them all, how happy are you on a scale of 1 to whatever with your marriage? And then they plotted a graph of satisfaction as a function of how long you've been married. And here's the picture that they came up with. A curve. They said, look, the people who've only been married a few years are pretty happy. And then the people who've been married for a moderate number of years are less happy. But look, those people who've been married really a long time, they get happier again. Why? Tell a story. What's this all about? How do you explain this curve? Anyone? What's your name? Robbie. Kids leave. That's right. You're happy? Romance, newlyweds, unwrapping presents, everything's great. Let's have a baby. Okay. Hey, 18 years passed. They're off to college. Woohoo, let's take that cruise. Looks great, doesn't it? And for decades, this was the story that people told about answering this question, how marital satisfaction changes over time. The story is, it starts out high, it gets low, and it gets better again at the end. The only problem is this: they didn't actually measure change at all, did they? They only measured marital satisfaction once in a lot of different people. Is it possible that the people who were married for 40 years were different people than the people who had been married only 20 years? Well, to address that question, some other researchers, dare I say, better researchers, instead did longitudinal research. Was longitudinal research harder? Yes, way harder. Here's what they did. They got a bunch of college men, actually these all guys had all gone to Harvard, and the researchers named Valent and Valent followed them for 40 years. Instead of getting people who were married over a course of different 40 years, they follow the same individuals for 40 years. The problem with that kind of research is it takes 40 years. A lot of times the researchers are dead by the time you get the results, but boy, they're very good, interesting results. And they got these people to answer, how happy are you with your marriage over time? And here's what they found. Different picture. What they found is that marital satisfaction doesn't go up at the end. Now, by the way, the difference between this point and this point is the difference between what looks like 30.8 to, 25.8. It's not like these people are miserable. I don't want you to get the wrong idea. But marital satisfaction didn't go up. It didn't go up at the end. He found no evidence for a curve at the end. And guess what? No one has found any evidence for a curve at the end. But wow, a totally different story when you actually measure change. You get a totally different picture if you do the research wrong. So, if we want to describe what life is like, I can say this. I can say, you know what? People who've been married 40 years tend to be happier on average than people who are married 20 years. But these people, presumably, if Valent and Valent are right, used to be way up here. In fact, you might say you have to start here if you're still going to be around in 40 years. And that's the problem, is that a lot of these people, what happened to them? They divorced. They never made it to 40 years. So by the time you get to 40 years, who's left? Only the happiest people that were here. That's exactly why this happened. But the truth is this. So we have a design. We have our measurement strategy. We've decided whether we're going to ask people or observe them. We've decided whether we're going to do it once, if we want to describe what's going on, or whether we want to just do it many times if we want to predict change over time. Now, who are we going to study? Well, if you're American, you're in luck, because most of this research has been done on Americans. But you might guess that the answers to some of our questions may differ in different countries. I put Chinese up there just because it's a different country than America, but you could imagine, are relationships in America different than in China, than in Saudi Arabia, than in Guatemala, than in Iceland? The fact is that, as we'll discuss later in the course, there are similarities and differences. I was saying last time that all over the world, people want a partner that they love. All over the world, in every kind of society, people want a partner who cares for them and treats them well. But the definition of caring, the specific behaviors that equal treating me well, vary across countries. We have to pay attention to what kind of generalizations do we want to make. What about rich versus poor? This is an issue now because most research on relationships studies people who went to college because it's easy to find them. Just go to a college. But you imagine that the relationships of people who went to college may be different from the relationships of people who don't go to college. I'll tell you, the relationships of people who like their jobs, who chose their jobs, are different from the relationships of people, maybe, who don't like their jobs. And yet, well, another distinction. How old do we want to study? Do we want to study people who are recently married or people who have been married for 40 years? There's a difference. Because it's going to affect the answer. What if our question is, how important is sex to liking your marriage? I'm guessing here that and I could be wrong. I'd like to find out if I'm wrong. The intuition is that it's more important for younger relationships than for very old relationships. We'll find out. And what about the difference between dating and married? I can give you an example of this one. Boy, this one bugs me. I was at a conference, and I was seeing a presentation, and someone was asking a pretty good question, which is, there are different reasons to stay in a relationship. One reason to stay in a relationship would be because you love your partner and can't live without them. Another conceptually independent reason to stay with your relationship would be that you have shared investments with your partner, and you would lose a lot if you left. There are obstacles to leaving. You can imagine those are different reasons. Either I stay because I love you and I want to stay, or I stay because I have to, because I would lose too much if I left. Well, these people did a study. They wanted to know which of those reasons is more important. So they gathered data, and they reported, they got up there in front of professionals and said, guess what? The satisfaction reason is way more important than the investment reason. I said, where'd you gather that data? Oh, we gathered that data from the Psych 10 pool. They're from college students who are dating. Well, in college students don't have any investments with their partners. They barely share a sweatshirt. There's nothing to lose. So of course, satisfaction is all that's keeping them together. If you don't got that, the relationship breaks up. Of course. But you're studying only dating people. You cannot make a generalization of married people because of that particular question. The answer is going to be totally different if you study married people. Well, we're going to be paying attention to that in this course, is who's being studied. Because the way relationships work may be different across countries, across socioeconomic status, across age, and across relationship status. We've got to pay attention to that, make these choices consciously. Also, we want to know, who are we studying, individuals or couples? It's interesting because if you study individuals, and we know from what I was talking about earlier that individuals don't always agree, two individuals in a relationship don't always agree on what's going on in that relationship. So sometimes if you study couples, you'll get a very different view than if you study individuals. Finally, is it right? Is it ethical to do this work? Maybe it's wrong. Maybe human beings were not meant to study this stuff scientifically. The argument that this is not ethical, part of it starts with this. We're asking sometimes very sensitive questions. And here's something that's true. Simply being asked a question can affect somebody. Have you ever, I'm not going to ask you even the most sensitive questions because I think that would be rude. But imagine if I asked somebody, have you had sexual fantasies about someone other than your partner? That's pretty serious. Have you ever been beaten up by your partner? Has your partner ever imposed sex on you against your will? Just being asked such questions can be very emotional. Having to just answer those questions can bring up stuff that we may not want to talk about or even think about. So when we do this research, we have to be very sensitive because asking a question can affect somebody. But what about being in a study? Does it affect you to be in research? Actually, it does. You imagine that if we're studying couples, asking these questions might force the couples to think about things that they wouldn't otherwise think about. People don't go around filling out satisfaction scales every day, even love scales every day. But what if I asked you to? What if I asked you to think so hard about your relationship? Can that change the relationship? Well, guess what? People have looked at this question. Here's how they did it. They got a study, people who were participating in a study, and they randomly assigned people to be studied many times or just once. Just twice. Once at the beginning of the study and once at the end. So some people over the course of, let's say, 2 years, filled out questionnaires 6 times, and some people filled out questionnaires just twice. And there was randomly assigned to either condition. Was there a difference between the two groups? Yes. What was the difference? How do you think being studied affects a relationship? How might it affect a relationship to be in a research study of relationships? Here was the effect. It magnified variability. It made the good relationships feel better about themselves, and it made the bad relationships feel worse about themselves. You can imagine. If I'm in a good relationship, every time you ask me about my relationship, you're reminding me how good it is. Thanks. But if I'm in a bad relationship, every time you ask me about the relationship, you're reminding me how bad it is. Hey, ouch. So being studied affects people. Doing the research changes what we're studying. Well, that's dangerous then. And in fact, in research that we've done, we ask people straight out, how was it to be in this study? Now that it's over, what was the experience like? And what we get is 95% of people say, I loved being in the study, thank you. It was really interesting. But between 3 and 5% of people say, I kind of hated it. I didn't like having to answer your questions because it made me think about things that made me uncomfortable. Oh, that's a real cost. And so then the question is, well, How do we weigh that? Do the costs outweigh the benefits? It's a judgment call. There's no right answer to that question. But I would say, at least since I do this work, that the benefits of learning how to make relationships better, the benefits of understanding this fundamental process in people's lives are pretty substantial. If we can help people solve some of these universal problems of relating to another person, I think that's a pretty enormous benefit. And we have learned a lot, and that's sort of what we'll talk about in this course. There's stuff that we've learned. And so all we can do then is try to minimize the costs. How? What are our obligations? We have a number of obligations that are very, very serious to make this research ethical, given that we know that research has an impact on the people we study. One obligation is treat people with respect. Treat them like they are participants in the research and not lab rats. Number two, treat their data with respect, and that means protecting the confidentiality of the people who participate in these studies. And that's what we do. In all this research, anyone who shares their intimate lives with a researcher is owed efforts to protect them. Because let's say I have, and as I often do, a husband in one room and a wife in the other room, and we say, hi, what's your partner's biggest fault? What irritates you about your partner? We have an obligation to make sure that that person doesn't hear what this person says. And I'll tell you, I've been in rooms with couples where a husband will tell me things that he says, you're not going to tell my wife this, are you? And it's stuff that she ought to know. But we have an obligation. That's not our role, to not tell. That's part of the ethical obligation. So those are some of what are our tools? Our tools are measurement, operationalization, a good design, a thoughtfully collected sample, and ethical research. I have to tell you one thing. It's quite possible that sometime very, very soon, my wife is going to have a baby. Thank you. When that happens, I'm going to help her take care of that baby for a little bit, and I will miss 4 lectures. During that time, Dr. Tom Bradbury will take over from me, and he will give those 4 lectures. Tom Bradbury, A, co-wrote The Reader with me, B, trained me, C, is a brilliant lecturer, and is a master of all this material. So one day, if you come into lecture and it's not me, then that's why. But as long as the baby doesn't come, you'll still have me and then I'll come back at the end of 4. That's it.